G'day, my name's Craig Castree. I'm from Edible Gardens and I'm here with Melton City Council Learning Directory, and I'm going to be discussing with you today edible gardening and sustainability, which is a pretty big topic, and we're actually going to break that up into two parts. So this is part one. To give you a bit of a setup, I'm a qualified horticulturalist. I'm a local business and I'm the author of a book, namely Edible Gardens, A Practical Guide. And I teach people how to become reasonably self-sufficient on their own blocks of land. And to give you an idea, I live on a block that's 500 square metres. I have a large single-storey house on the block and a very small garden that's left. So I've had to try and find some innovative ways of being able to grow what I can eat. So, and I haven't done that through a vegetable garden, and I think a lot of people get bogged down in building or making vegetable gardens, and it generally gets a lot of people into trouble, unfortunately. Vegetable gardens inherently are places where people plant all of their vegetables and generally out in full sun, and for a lot of vegetables that are large leaf plants, unfortunately is not really the ideal spot for them. And to give you an idea, if you're planting things like this in rows, you're actually attracting in your own pests and disease. And what happens is that there's never any mulch, very rarely any flowers in the garden, which I'll discuss at some length shortly. And if one gets a pest, they all get a pest. If one gets a disease, they all get the disease, which really isn't the way to go. And we take our lead from market gardeners, and of course they have to grow things like that. You know, it's like a monoculture scenario where they have acre upon acre of broccoli, and that's all they have. But they have to do that because they're feeding the masses. An edible garden is a very, very different way of being able to grow things rather than vegetable gardening. And this is sort of a bit like an edible garden, where you can see it's very different to the first photo regarding how it's been planted out. Now, this is probably a little bit overplanted in terms of the same thing. To be honest, I probably wouldn't plant that quite as densely, but the idea is to break it up with different variety of plants. That way it tends to help confuse and put the insects off the scent of things that are generally desirable. It's called companion planting, and we'll again get a bit stuck into that throughout this presentation. The tendency, I think, for most people is to dedicate a small area of their backyard and call that the vegetable patch, and that's where people tend to try and grow their own food. And as I alluded to earlier, that tends to get them into a lot of trouble. It's a lot of hard work too. It's farming where you've got to continually be turning over the soil and putting back humus and compost and so forth, because when you crop, the crop takes out the same amount of goodness, nutrition out of the soil, and you then need to replenish it again. Whereas when you're not cropping and you're simply growing plants that generally would grow together as they do in nature, that tends not to happen. So as I say, trying to find new and innovative ways of being able to fit things on small blocks of land, and this is an instance of that, where at the bottom across the raised bed I've got some different varieties of lettuce, and just in behind I've got a small row of beans. There's a zucchini in the background. Either side is a tomato. This is a great way of being able to fill in a small section of your garden and have it be productive at the same time. And of course in the backdrop you can see on the fence that there's a wall of strawberries placed one under the other. And of course that doesn't necessarily need to be strawberries. That could just as well be lettuce or spinach or some other small growing vegetable or edible plant. And I think that that's something that we tend not to do a lot of. We don't look at the areas in our garden that we have available that could potentially be being productive. One of the things I think that you should give some more thought to is that gardens need to be maintained and looked after no matter what they are, whether they're productive or not. And I think that for me, to have a productive garden is the answer. no amount of what I have to do in a garden, if it can give me back something, and particularly food, that's a win-win as far as I'm concerned. So in my garden, I tend, before I put anything in the garden, it has to have a reason for it to be there. It has to be either productive to produce food. It may be that it might shade a window that may block out the hot sun through the summer heat, and actually reduce my cooling costs. It might be something that will fix nitrogen into the soil and give back the soil as a result of its presence being there. It might be attracting in a local insect, or to pollinate something that might be in the backyard, like bees, to fruit trees and the like. It might also be to attract in predatory insects that will eat up the pests that you get when you sometimes are growing food. So I always make sure that when I'm going to select a plant, I've got an area in mind that it's going to be ideal for, but it has to have a purpose or perform a role. Okay, so that's a step back from that shop, and as you can see, citrus in the background, a wall of strawberries, using the fence wisely, and in fact, if you look closely, there is a 13mm pipe across the top of the top row of the strawberry pots, and I've got a drip feed into each of the top pots, and they're on a timer. So what happens is that the top pot, as it drains, waters the pots below it over about a half an hour period. So very easy to fit a lot of food in a very short, small area. So now we talked a little bit about companion planting, and it just so happens that at this time of year, it's garlic season, and that's one of the reasons why I brought along some garlic. And if you've got some garlic that's starting to look a bit like this, and it's starting to sprout, please don't throw it out. It's ideal for putting into the ground. And what I start and do is I start thinking about what goes well with garlic, and this is how companion planting works. One of the sayings that I use a lot is, what goes well on the plate together goes well in the ground together. So one of those great marriages on the plate is tomato, basil and garlic. But of course, tomato and basil don't go in the ground until around about October, November, but garlic needs to go in now. So I start and think about where I'm likely to put some tomatoes in my garden beds somewhere. And I alluded to before, I don't grow things or crop things together. So particularly not tomatoes, because tomatoes are quite susceptible to pests and particular disease. So they're ones you really want to make sure that you separate pretty well. So what I do is I put a ring of garlic, so I'll peel these down into individual cloves, and if they haven't shot, that's okay. You don't need to worry too much about that. And I'll plant a ring of them, around about a metre in diameter. About the size of this table would be an ideal, scenario of planting garlic. And in the meantime, you could grow other things around in between the garlic. It might be some spring onions, or it might be some lettuce. It could be anything. It could be some spinach. In fact, at home, I've actually put some fennel in the middle of it. But by the time October comes, I will have harvested not only the lettuce that I would have planted in between the garlic, but the fennel will certainly will have been harvested, and the middle of that ring of garlic will mark the spot for where I put a tomato in the ground. Now, they have a symbiotic relationship in the ground, because the tomato loves to have garlic nearby it, because it keeps certain pests away from it, like thrip, whitefly and the like. I also interplant in the October-November months it with some different varieties of basil. And if you think about what goes well on the plate together with tomato, basil and garlic, they're great salad items that you could also attribute to that group. You could put in some lettuce, some spring onions and the like. The other thing that I also always plant with that group of three is marigolds. Now, marigolds keep nematodes away from the tomatoes' roots in the soil. Whereas if you planted tomatoes all together with none of those things around them, you'll find that if one gets a pest or a disease, they're all going to get it. And I might add, when you go to water these plants, you're often standing at the end of a row with a hose. You've got no way of being able to tell how much you water one versus the next, or the one in the middle, how much that got versus the one on the far end of the row. Whereas when you're watering these individual ones, like in this group that I just described before, you tend to water that plant much more according to its size and how it's growing, rather than the whole row. So if that makes sense to you. So tomato, basil, some garlic, marigolds are a great marriage made in the ground as well as they are on the plate. There's a bit of rosemary in the background as well. So companion planting is certainly one of those things that I think that all of us could learn a lot from, because being able to limit the amount of chemicals that you're using in your backyard is going to mean much healthier produce for you and for what your family are eating. And there's that scenario of the garlic, tomato in the middle, and you can see it's dotted with some basil and some different varieties of lettuce and so on. You'll notice the inclusion of mulch. Now, we probably should talk a little bit about mulch while I've brought it up. Mulch is not pebbles or bark, to be honest. I mean, those sorts of things are really meant for native gardens. What I would prefer to see people use in edible gardens is something like a sugarcane mulch, or a really well chopped up pea straw, but it needs to be chopped up well, because a lot of people do use straw and pea straw, but the problem is that it's too open and it still allows quite a lot of the sunlight in there to dehydrate the soil. The soil gets dried up, the soil warms up, and it sends all the composting insects down deep into the soil about 200 millimetres from where the topsoil is, which becomes a problem, because that then starts to dry out that top 1 foot layer of soil, which means that it becomes hard. And it also is very difficult to try and get water to penetrate through it. So a covering of mulch on soil that you're growing edible plants in is very, very important. Now, I only put mulch on for around about 20 to 25 mil thick. You don't want it on any thicker than that. Gone are the days where you would put it on 4 inches thick. That's just craziness. And what happens when it is on that thick, when you're watering, you don't get good penetration down onto the soil and down into the plant's roots. So this mulch layer of about 25 millimetres, it does quite a few things. Not only does it stop the sun from dehydrating and drying the soil out, but it also performs a bit of a blanket for the insects, and it also provides that cover from the sun so that the soil cools down enough, particularly in the hot summer months, and it allows those composting insects to return to the topsoil. And in doing so, what happens is they start to eat away at that little bit of mulch and leaf litter that becomes that top layer, and they start to aerate the soil for you, so that when you fertilise or when you water, you're getting really good penetration down near where the plant's roots are, because of them working the soil for you. So I don't work my soil, folks. I don't turn my soil over ever. That's all hard work. That's farming. And if you ask the farmers, they'll tell you farming is hard work. And when you're cropping, and you're not using things like mulch, then that's what's going to get you into some trouble. So mulch is a very, very important thing. And like I said, things like bark, unless they're a native garden, I just wouldn't use bark, because what inherently happens is that it tends to start and draw out nitrogen from the soil, and sometimes it can still have quite a lot of toxins and resins in the soil that they're not terribly good for edible plants. So moving along, edible gardens are a very different looking garden to a vegetable garden, and as you can see, there's quite a lot of colour in amongst this, and you'll notice that the advent of no rows of anything, arches being used to grow things like passion fruit and beans, runner beans. That's a scarlet runner bean in the foreshot there with those nice little scarlet flowers, and utilising that fence is another way of being able to grow food. And you'll notice that there's not a tree canopy in here, but you'll soon see I've got trees that I grow two-dimensionally along the fence, which I'll talk about at some length very shortly. Raised beds are another great way of being able to get these things to happen. Raised beds actually allow you to water more frequently, and that actually helps the plant's growth if you can do that. But it's not necessary. You don't absolutely have to have raised beds to grow a good edible garden. Wide-leaf plants don't require as much sun as people think. Things like broccoli, cabbage, collie, silver beet, kale, lettuce, all of those even tomatoes, don't like full sun all day. They grow quite well, and most of them enjoy being in the shade by around about 12:30, 1 o'clock. And if you can provide that sort of aspect, particularly over the warmer months, you'll do so well. This is a broccoli, and beside it is a cauliflower, and that's on the south wall of my house. That gets no more sun than up till about 11:30 in the morning. That's as much sun as it gets, and have a look at it. It's incredible that they grow so well in the shade. And I guess, like I said, we tend to take our lead from market gardeners that are growing them out in the full sun with row after row of the same plant. But you can rest assured, these things in their natural habitat are forest dwellers. They've got those wide leaves for a very good reason. They actually filter the sunlight through the treetops where they're naturally grown. And I think that when we learn that will give you an opportunity of being able to fit some of these things underneath the canopy of some of the existing trees and shrubs in your own gardens. And it doesn't necessarily need to be grown out the back in the backyard. It can be grown in the front yard as well. So yeah, it really is. We've got to think a little differently to understand how best we can fit all these edibles in. I talked about attracting in beneficial insects before, and there are three types. So we've talked already about what we can do about getting in the composting insects. So things like worms, millipedes, centipedes, slaters. They're all wonderful little insects that actually help us immensely in the backyard or in the garden, because when you've got that cover of mulch on the ground and you're cooling it down and allowing them to come back up and aerate the soil, and you're getting great penetration of water when you're watering, and they're taking down food as well as converting that mulch layer into food as they compost it down. That's a wonderful thing, and bear in mind that soil is a living thing, and they're a big part of that environment. So the next thing you need to think about is how do I get pollinators in? So you need to be starting to give some thought to what sort of flowers that you might like to bring in to attract in certain insects that will help pollinate, things like bees, butterflies, hoverflies, all of the flying insects that do that. And in fact, sometimes it can be birds. So attracting in habitat, so that's a lavender, and that's one of the better ones for things like the European honeybee. I have a hedge across the front of my house that is one is rosemary and one is lavender, rather than box hedge like most people put in. And when this is in flower, you can actually nearly hear it hum with bees. They don't worry anyone. No one's ever been stung through bees. So please don't think that when you're attracting in bees, you're attracting in a problem. You're not. This little guy is a blue-banded bee. This is one of the native bees in Victoria, Victorian blue-banded bee. That's on one of my apple flowers. Now, these guys love mauve and blue flowering plants. So if you dot your garden with things like salvia and small lavenders and the like, you'll find that you'll attract these guys in. And of course, when you've got your apple flowers out or your fruit tree flowers out, these guys will come along and help pollinate them. Particularly, this guy loves tomatoes, and this is probably going to be a little hard to see, but this fuzzy little insect there is a blue-banded bee in flight. And they're very diligent when they come to pollinate tomatoes. They fly from one flower to the next and they come back day after day. So if you can get these guys in near your tomatoes, you'll do very well. So one of the key plants that I'd be making sure I put in my backyard would be the blue salvia or small lavender bushes. The European honeybee doesn't like tomatoes, so unfortunately if you haven't got some of those plants in there to attract in this little guy, you might get a lesser crop than you'd like. So beneficial insects in the garden, like I said before, is bees, things like hoverflies, butterflies. Speaking of butterflies, you'll be noticing a lot of white cabbage butterflies around at the moment, and there seems to be a bit of a plague of them. I know they certainly are at my place, they're everywhere. So when I put things that attract them in, like broccoli, cabbage, cauliflowers, even bok choy they like, I always plant some white violas or white pansies by one or two plants here or there. And what happens is that white cabbage moth is very territorial, and they're not got terribly good eyesight, insects. They recognise things by leaf shape. So hence if you're planting in a whole row of cabbage and you're wondering why you're getting hit by cabbage moth, that's why. It's all planted together. They can see straight away what it is, whereas if you plant a cabbage and dot that with, let's say lettuce and a spring onion and maybe a marigold or a white viola, particularly a white viola, what will happen is that if it happens to recognise the broccoli or the cabbage, whatever it is, you'll find that the minute it sees one of these, particularly fluttering in the wind, it looks little bit like one of them. And they don't like the rivalry, so they tend to fly off and go and attack someone else that's got their plants out in rows. So it's a good way forward to try and deter insect attack. Of course, when they lay their eggs underneath the leaves and they hatch, that's what you get. And this is why they're a little hard to see sometimes because of the camouflage that they have. But you certainly see the evidence of when they've started to take off that you get eaten out of house and home. So the more of these you can deter, the better. Attracting plants like seaside daisy or origerons, which is what this plant's called, attracts in these little guys, the hoverfly. Now, a lot of people ask me sometimes, are these guys okay? I mean, are they good guys or bad guys? And let me tell you, they are fantastic. You often see them in number, they hover, and I'm sure people will know what they are. They're about half the size of a bee with that little black body on their abdomen, and they love aphids. So if you get things like roses, as you can see, look, here's the hoverfly here, and here is a rosebud full of aphids. So if you've got roses, so it doesn't necessarily just need to be edibles. You want to be planting something like a marigold or a calendula underneath your rose trees, or nearby things that are susceptible to them. Things like lettuce are one that attracts in aphid. Same with the brassicas. Here's a ladybird beetle on lettuce, and guess what? They're picking up aphids. So these predatory insects are really, really important things for you to be trying to attract in your garden. It's not necessarily just the pollinators, it's the predatory insects as well. Sometimes they can be small wasps that will inject their eggs into caterpillars that become the host for their young to thrive on. And of course, that ultimately kills the caterpillar. So they're a great thing to have on your side. One of the other things I'll talk about today is some of the companions that we spoke about earlier with the tomato, basil and garlic. This is another one, and sometimes you do have to crop. And there are two that come to mind at the moment. Corn is one of those. Because they're wind pollinated, you must grow them in rows or in blocks. And when I put them in the ground, I make sure I put them in blocks about 4 by 4. And I surround, once they get to about knee height, I surround them by with peas or beans. Now, I do that for a very good reason, and the reason is this, that corn is a nitrogen hog, and it strips the ground of nitrogen. So guess what grows on the roots of peas and beans? They're nitrogen fixing plants. So they replenish the soil with the nitrogen that corn's taking out. And of course the upshot is that the corn provides something for the peas and the beans to climb. And on the plate together, peas and corn go really well. So there you go, there's another one of those reminders. Well, that's it for the first session. Please stay tuned for part 2 in edible gardening and sustainability, and I'll see you at that session.